representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Madam President, it is clear to those following the session today that this is yet another attempt by some countries to seize the 10-year anniversary of the crisis in Syria as an opportunity to continue to rally against the Syrian state, leveling all kinds of accusations against it, and promoting their failed policies. Therefore, I would like to give an honest account of what happened in Syria over the past 10 years, to clarify all the facts. On this day, 10 years ago, the governments of some countries, mainly the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, launched an unprecedented war of aggression on Syria, a multifaceted war, to undermine Syria's national positions, to target the legitimate government, and to tarnish the image of its leadership. They did so through their terrorist proxies, in a grave violation of the principles of international law and the provisions of the UN Charter. This goes to show that those countries gave precedence to the law of force over the force of law. Over the past 10 years, those governments have made every effort to pit Syrians against each other and to sow chaos that they considered creative. They spent huge sums of money to fuel and prolong a tragic crisis, aiming to undermine Syria's security and stability, its historic achievements, its development, and its territorial integrity. The past 10 years have proven that those governments do not learn from their previous experiences. They keep going back to the same old rulebook and applying the same old strategies, using extremist terrorist groups as a tool to serve their hostile agendas. Those governments have recruited terrorists from all over the world and transferred them to Syria, facilitated by the Turkish regime, to cause death and wreak havoc in my country. The great irony is that these same governments used those terrorists as an excuse to form an illegal international coalition to combat terrorism based on a distorted interpretation of Article 51 of the Charter. This illegal coalition has killed thousands of innocent civilians. What happened in Raqqa is a case in point. The true goal of this illegal coalition was not to combat terrorist groups of its own making. Its true goal was to weaken the Syrian Arab Army as it fights ISIS and other terrorist groups. The true goal of this illegal coalition is to weaken the Syrian government by destroying civilian facilities such as schools, hospitals, power plants, bridges, and dams, causing tremendous human suffering. This so-called international coalition is in fact an American coalition that US administrations use to attack the people of the region. Over the past 10 years, those countries have given terrorist groups free rein to kill and displace people, to change the demography of the region, to recruit children, plunder the oil and cultural property, burn agricultural crops, and deprive the population of drinking water. Add to that what can be considered a Turkification policy practiced by the Turkish regime in the areas it occupies. Over the past 10 years, the delegates of those countries repeated the same hypocritical statements, expressing their grave concern over the humanitarian situation in Syria, while at the same time applying unilateral coercive measures, imposing a suffocating siege on the Syrian people and preventing reconstruction. All of that resulted in catastrophic consequences for every Syrian citizen that affected every aspect of their lives, especially women and children. These unilateral coercive measures are so cruel they can only be considered economic terrorism. Over the past 10 years, those governments have paid lip service to Syria's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, preaching that the solution can only be political, not military. All the while, they have violated in the worst way possible the sovereignty and independence of Syria. American military forces have been operating in the northeast and the southeast of Syria, while Turkish forces have been active in the north and the northwest, not to mention the continued Israeli occupation of the Syrian Arab Golan and the systematic attacks it carries out every day. After all of this, how could we believe that those countries support a political solution in Syria? How could we believe they adhere to Resolution 2254 when they deliberately and systematically violate its main provision, namely respect for the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic? The destructive policies of the past 10 years were doomed to fail, thanks to the resilience of the Syrian people, united behind their leadership. After such failure, shouldn't those governments now rethink their policies? Or do they want another decade of failed policies and more destruction in Syria? Those governments must now look realistically at the current situation in Syria and realize the impact of their hostile policies on Syria in particular and the region in general. They must act to correct those wrong policies and adopt new constructive approaches based on respect for international law, based on diplomacy and objective dialogue in order to allow the return of peace and stability to Syria and the region. Madam President, we have listened carefully to the briefing of the Special Envoy, which we had hoped would address adequately and clearly the various aspects that I referred to above, especially the actual obstacles to achieving a political solution. We call on the United Nations and its Special Envoy to take a clear position on these challenges and these violations, and to exercise their role in implementing and protecting the purposes and principles of the Charter, which Syria helped draft. In mid-February, the 15th round of the Astana format was held in the Russian city of Sochi and issued a significant declaration that reaffirmed the strong commitment to the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic, and continued cooperation until the complete elimination of terrorist groups in Syria. The declaration also rejected separatist agendas that aim to undermine the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria, as well as attempts to create a de facto situation on the ground under the pretext of combating terrorism. The Astana Declaration also rejected the plunder of Syrian oil, that is, the exclusive property of the Syrian state, and the unilateral coercive measures imposed on Syria. It condemned the continued Israeli attacks on Syria and demanded an end to such aggression. Finally, the declaration expressed support to the political Syrian-owned, Syrian-led process, including the Constitutional Committee. In this context, my delegation would like to thank the delegations of the Russian Federation and the Islamic Republic of Iran for their continued contribution to the success of this round. We call on the Turkish regime to fulfill its obligations under the Astana Agreements and the Sochi Understandings, and to cease its practices that do not contribute to an environment conducive to a political solution. Madam President, Damascus welcomed the visit of Special Envoy Mr. Guy Peterson on February 22nd. Mr. Peterson held constructive talks with the Foreign Minister, who reaffirmed Syria's commitment to a Syrian-owned and Syrian-led political process, facilitated by the United Nations in accordance with the relevant Security Council resolutions. These resolutions all affirm, in their preamble, the strong commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. In this regard, my delegation stresses that for the work of the Constitutional Committee to succeed, its agreed rules of procedures must be respected. We reject any external interference in its work and any attempt to dictate its conclusions or impose artificial deadlines. We look forward to the holding of the 6th round of the Constitutional Committee as soon as possible. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.